I'm Bill Dutton, the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm one of the editors of Information, Communication, and Society. And we have others who are associated with the journal here today, including Steve Woolgard, who's on the editorial board, and others. And, this session was going to be chaired by Brian Loader, and he is snowed in Teesside, England. Snow in the north of England has had its toll today. So he is going to be one virtue of having a webcast of a research meeting is that the chair today will be watching this from afar. But I just received yesterday, actually today, a PDF version of all the draft articles for the Volume 8, Number 1 of Information, Communication, and Society. And the lead article is by Chris Caswill, our speaker today, and it's entitled Whose Agency? Looking Forward to the Virtual Research Council. And one of an innovation we've tried to carry out at ICS, at the journal, is to occasionally and as often as possible take one of the lead articles of the journal, webcast a session on that article, and begin to make the journal more of a virtual journal than it may otherwise have been an old-fashioned paper version. But we're really happy to do that with Chris Caswill. As you know, Chris Caswill has been Director of Research for the Economic and Social Research Council for how many years?
About 15.
Almost 15 years. When I was Director of the Program on Information and Communication Technology in the mid-90s, I got to know Chris, and he's extremely well experienced in research in one of the major research councils for the social sciences in Britain. He is now has left the council, but he is a visiting research fellow at the James Martin Institute, a new institute at the University of Oxford. And what he's going to do, he's agreed to take 10 or 15 minutes to give a very summary overview of his paper. The paper is available online, and then we will open it up for discussion. And we have at least 30 minutes, and we may be going over a bit. And an edited version of this webcast will be available on the OII website and possibly through the ICS. So thank you very much for coming, Chris.
Cool. Thank you very much. Well, the first thing I did when I was thinking about this webcast after kind of panicking was to think, well, what is this paper about? And that set me thinking when I reread it. And I thought, well, actually, this is a paper about ICTs and their impact on public agencies. Or is it perhaps a paper on the use of principal agent theory for understanding change? Or is it about research councils as institutions of science? Or is it about the imagined future of those kinds of institutions? Well, in a way, it's about all of those things. And the first thing I want to do really, I think, is to thank Bill and Brian and to acknowledge their support for taking this kind of slightly unusual hybrid paper and putting it in their journal. I'm very much grateful for that. I'm very sorry Brian isn't here, but if he's watching at home, hello to you, Brian. I particularly want also to thank Bill, who's over many years helped bring this paper to publication. I first gave a version of this, I think, in the year 2000, and it's been through a number of variations since then. It's a paper of many, I think what I've learnt now to call many knowledge fragments, and I hope I've been able to bring these fragments together in some kind of interesting whole. Actually, really, this is a paper about funding institutions. It's about research councils. It follows the line of thinking developing recently that the allocation of resources for science is an important, a central and important aspect of our understanding of science. There's been a relatively large flurry of interest in research councils in recent years. Many papers written from the principal agent perspective, and they're discussed in the paper. What my paper seeks to do is to identify a gap, nevertheless, in this literature, which I think doesn't sufficiently attend to what David Guston called in one of his earlier principal agent articles, the what and how of institutions, the everyday realities of research councils. So the method I've chosen to try and address these everyday realities is the slightly unusual one, perhaps, of trying to imagine a future where information and communication technologies are adapted and adopted successfully and without hitch by the funding organisations we want to look at. And to think this through, drawing on some principal agent perspectives as has been used in these recent studies. The first benefit of this approach, as with all good ICT implementation, is that you need to look behind the apparent structures to see what actual components exist in these organisations. And this has led me to propose a generic Research Council input-output model, which is set out in the paper, which basically focuses on the issues of ideas and money and suggests that these are the core inputs and outputs for research councils. From this analysis, I've derived what I call 7 or 8 core characteristics of research councils. They provide and allocate resources, they're concerned to maximise their own income, they're concerned with input of ideas, they're essentially concerned with quality control, they're interconnected intermediary agencies, nationally located, and primarily concerned with issues of delegation. And I argue in the paper that the historical perspective suggests that these characteristics of research councils have been stable over time. I then go on, however, to suggest that there are some more recent characteristics acquired, or in some cases required of them, in the period of what we might think of as late modernity. And the first of these is the issue of priority setting, which now engages so many of our national funding agencies. Secondly, they are much more concerned in recent times to support research capacity. They've become very much more driven towards issues of post hoc evaluation of research quality. They are engaging, as so many institutions of science, with the needs and interests of publics and stakeholders, and they're being pushed and pressurized towards a much greater direct concern with knowledge production and transfer. So what I've done in the paper is to take these, what I call core essential characteristics, and these late modern requirements, and try to use them to build up a picture of an institution, a virtual research council, where these characteristics are affected by the perfect adoption of a set of information and communication technologies. Fairly straightforward things like the web, fast connections, remote technology, and so on. I was reflecting, as preparing for this note, that the slightly dated nature of these technologies may owe something to the relative pace of, on the one hand, technological change, and on the other hand, publishing papers, because, of course, there have been many developments since this paper was written and submitted. What I've done in the paper is to look at the transformational opportunities that these information and communication technologies provide within 4 sets of virtual research council activities. And I've christened, if you like, this new research council driven by the ICT changes as the virtual research council. And what I look at is the impact of these technologies on 4, as I said, key activities. The activities of application, review and decision. And I look at the ways in which ICTs could be used to transform the processes by which applications are submitted, reviewed and decided. I look at the issue of setting priorities. I look at the way in which output and evaluation opportunities for research councils would change with the benefit of ICTs, and I look at the way organisation within the research council is likely to be affected. I'll just take one of these because time is not on our side, and just say something about what I've said about setting priorities within the virtual research council. What I do in the paper is to identify 4 streams of priority setting that exist at the present time in research councils and research agencies. Priorities that come from ministries, priorities that are driven by scientific push, priorities driven by the kind of corporate selection interests of the research council itself, and priorities which come from consultation and wider debate. And I've suggested that new information and communication technologies would offer transformational opportunities in each of these categories, though in 2 main respects. They will facilitate speedy consultation with much larger numbers of people. Secondly, they provide new opportunities for data analysis in support of funding decisions, for example, analyses of current research and patterns of disciplinary funding. Perhaps the biggest set of opportunities for research councils in this intermediary agency role, which I've argued in the paper, is their opportunity to consult with wider publics. We know that there are political and social pressures growing, encouraging movement in this direction, for example in the UK in the House of Lords 2000 report. But The opportunity for making use of web-based consultation, fora, video conferencing and technologies for online voting or expressions of opinion would, if used effectively, allow the Virtual Research Council to draw much more quickly on a wider range of appropriate samples of opinion. There would be a significant increase in the speed and quality of that interaction. The new ICTs would give councils a much greater opportunity for connectivity to other agencies. The Virtual Research Council will be all too well aware, as Ari Ripp has written, that it suffers competition from private foundations, from research councils operating in other fields of science, and perhaps from another council with a formally overlapping remit. In the future, it may suffer competition also from research agencies in other countries. It will need to compete vigorously and also to cooperate, as happens in the UK multi-council system today. But for the Research Council, the benefit of the inclusion of supporters and contributors from outside the academy will strengthen its legitimacy, and both with the research community, but also with its own principals in the ministries of science. This kind of process, however, will of course not necessarily be smooth. We can expect opposition. There will be several losers from innovations of this kind. Powerful internal decision makers risk losing influence over priority processes. University institutions and actors may find their freedom of manoeuvre constrained at a time when many already feel subjected to excessive influence by central institutions. Individual academic actors working within the Council may feel that these new technological opportunities diminish and threaten their own role. And of course, not least, ministries would also risk loss of control and challenges to their legitimacy as representatives of democratic opinion. So I've quoted that section of the paper to give you some flavour of the arguments that I'm putting forward in terms of the impact of ICTs on Research Council processes. What I then do is to move on from there to analyse these proposals on 4 dimensions, which are drawn heavily from Principal-Agent Theory and literature. What I do is I look at the impact of information and communication technologies on delegation, that's to say delegation between the Ministry and the Research Council and between the Research Council and the funding community. I look at connectivity, that's to say the ability of research councils in future to connect both across national boundaries and within national boundaries in ways which are not open to them at the present. One of the key issues faced by all funding agencies is the way in which they can restrain or constrain the issue of uncertainty within their business processes. And the use of new ICTs will offer funding agencies new opportunities for managing that uncertainty. Not, I stress in the paper, to remove it, but to manage it in ways which are beneficial to the Council's objectives. So, for example, this brings in the whole issue of improvements in the ability of councils to monitor progress of research as it goes on, and to evaluate in much more like real time the progress of research projects, and for those evaluations to feed back into future decisions. I also argue in the paper that one of the particular interesting dimensions of this introduction of information and communication technologies will be the relations between the research councils and, on the one hand, its principals, and on the other hand, the universities. And I argue that the capacity or otherwise of research agencies of this kind to introduce effective information and communication technologies will have a decisive effect on their own relative power and influence in relation, on the one hand, as I say, to the ministries which provide them with their finance, and to the institutions of the academy who they're seeking to shape and influence in their turn. So, from my conclusions that I draw from this, this is a very rapid run through what is quite a long paper, but my conclusions come under 3 or 4 different headings. For research councils, I think that it's possible, using this kind of mind game methodology, to identify, I argue in the paper, to identify some generic tasks for research councils. This is quite an important point within the literature on research councils, which has tended up until now to emphasize the diversity and variety between national funding agencies. But by using this kind of consultants systems methodology of trying to break down the core components, I think it is possible to see, and I want to argue that there are indeed these generic characteristics of councils which exist across the piece. A second important part of the paper is to argue that the whole role within funding agencies of monitoring and evaluation, what is called monitoring and evaluation, the capacity of the councils to assess quality after the event, after the decisions have been taken to produce funding, this will move into the centre stage of the agency business. I think I've argued in the paper also that for research councils, these ICTs really highlight the importance of their relationships both with their ministry principals and with the agents in the research community who they're seeking to fund and support. And of course I argue in the paper, and this supporting I think the paper that Paul David himself has produced within this institute, that you can see by looking at these cases that this is by no means a deterministic technological push. There are large numbers of choices to be made by the actors within the research councils about the way these technologies are used, and those choices in several cases are likely to be absolutely crucial. In regards to ICTs, I believe that that I've shown in the paper that the pace of change within research agencies is crucial to their own future. Their ability to become and sustain their position as key actors is likely to be dependent on their ability to introduce these new information and communication technologies at a faster rate than other actors within those kinds of configurations. I've argued in the paper also, with examples, that one of the key issues for ICTs is not bringing in so much of new technologies, but the ability of agencies like research councils to integrate technologies and to make use of them in an integrated manner in support of their decision making. So it's not exactly not the quality of the ICTs or their novelty, but their capacity for integration which will prove to be decisive. For principal-agent theory, I think this paper has provided some further support for its ability to construct futures as well as analyse pasts, and I think it has emphasised the growing arguments within principal-agent for two-way flows of influence between principals and agents, because one of the core points that I want to have made in the paper is that research councils can, of course, only proceed in this bright new future to the extent to which they're able to continue to recruit and bring with them the leading research performers within the research institutions. So to the extent to which they apply the information and communication technology beyond its potential, so to speak, for constructive dialogue, then they are likely to frighten off or disenchant key actors whom they need to keep on board. And the same point can also be made with the ministries, because clearly the research councils can only move at a pace at which their ministry principals are prepared to tolerate. And it's very clear from the UK experience that there's a very crucial issue about the extent to which, for example, ministries of science are prepared to allow funding agencies such as research councils to develop technologies independent from ministry influence and control. And then in conclusion, I just want to say the title, Whose Agency, does I think have a very clear answer from this paper. It's clear that if you look at the ways in which research councils are able or not able to develop these kinds of technologies, that they have been and will remain agents of the state. And it is my view within the principal agent framework that research agencies, contrary I think to some of the wishful thinking which exists sometimes in the academic literature, are agents of the state, and that the state has a key role in allowing and encouraging research councils to develop. And if the virtual research council is to develop, then it has to be done with the explicit agreement of the principal ministries in the state. The important point here is that the state can at any time close, reshape and diminish a research council. Other actors cannot, though their capacity to influence research councils is of course fully accepted.
Thank you, Chris. Anyway, if anyone wishes, we have actually an ability for people who are watching the webcast to email. So if people in here wish to email, you can get on your wireless. But I'd prefer you ask in person. I would think, I mean, given your last summary point, Chris, I mean the fact that you're almost saying that the ministries are slowing. Potentially it will develop at the pace that ministries wish it to develop. But it seems like, if anything, I mean, if you look at the Virtual Research Council as compared with, well, the use of the internet and new media in almost any other sector, one of the principal themes is that intermediaries are likely to lose influence. There will be more direct connections between ministries and others, for example. So it seems like it's all in the interest of ministries to move rapidly towards a virtual research council. And it's in their political, or they may have an interest, self-serving interest in doing that. So it's interesting that they are perhaps the braking effect on this. I mean, what's wrong with my
I think my response would be that if principals in ministries or in any other kind of state institution of that kind think through the opportunities that exist in developing something like the Virtual Research Council of the ideal type which is in this paper, then I imagine they could readily be nervous about the opportunities that that kind of agency would have, which they currently don't have. And I make just one point in relation to that in the paper. There's a lot of exhortation of public agencies to reach out at the present to wider democratic influences and publics. If we can imagine a world in which a research funding agency has successfully established those kind of links with wider publics, with stakeholders beyond the normal ranges of, let's call it the academy, then in those kinds of discussions that might take place between that kind of Virtual Research Council and the ministry would be of a different kind. Because in a way the Virtual Research Council would have achieved a legitimacy of its own which it currently doesn't have. And with state institutions themselves under pressures in terms of their kind of democratic legitimacy, this might be a further interesting shift, I think, in kind of power relations. So I can imagine that ministries, state institutions of that kind might be nervous about this kind of development being pushed forward to its kind of further conclusions.
York.
Well, I'm just going to throw in a concrete case on that particular issue. I mean, it seems to be one of the most influential research councils in the world is DARPA in the States. And the memory that comes to my mind is that, if you remember, about 10 years ago, DARPA effectively was creating high-definition television in America. And they were slapped down very firmly by the government and told to stop that, because, of course, it was going to compete with the makers of televisions. In other words, they'd done exactly what DARPA had shown, an amazing initiative. It created, essentially, the possibility of high-definition television in the States. All of its own initiative got its bottom soundly whacked. I mean, I'm just giving an example of adventurism brought to heel.
But its marketplace viability and its artistic viability are not yet proven.
No, I wasn't defending the action. I'm saying it's an interesting case, though, isn't it? I mean, there is one. There's somebody doing it. If it's an institutional state, it's certainly a research council.
Steve, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I thought this throws out all sorts of interesting issues. Thanks very much, Chris. I loved your reference to how you're doing this mind game methodology, which I think which phrase I think does not appear in the published version, which is quite interesting. But it sets me thinking about guessing the future, and I got a real sense from the paper that this is about the possibilities, and this will come about if various actors and institutions make the right decisions, even though some of them have interests in making the wrong decisions. That seems to be the sort of the framework of the... And I just wondered whether it would be worth thinking about tying down the potential coming to fruition of this stuff, much more in terms of the sort of nitty-gritty practices of who the hell's going to use this and why. I mean, today we have news that the E-University, this massive £50 million endeavour, has been wound up because only 900 people bothered to sign up for it. And on the way, the senior managers are awarding themselves hefty pay rises for developing this. I'm starting to think in my own work that the best way round to think about these new projects and futures for technology is to adopt an altogether more modest approach. My uncle has this attitude to cars. He said, he's a priest, he says of cars, sometimes they work. And I'm wondering whether analytically this might be a preferred option, to think of all the reasons why this couldn't possibly work as the starting point, to bear in mind that these huge projects inevitably, not even almost invariably fail.
Yes, I think there's a great deal of sense in that. I mean, this is as you say, in a way, as one of a whole number of scenarios that one could posit for the future. I suppose this could be seen as a scenario where all the technologies work in a completely unrealistic way, but that the human decisions are more or less realistic in relation to those kind of opportunities. That's what I've tried to suggest. And I think I would want to suggest that, I mean, there would be many more, I think, utopian futures that one could project than one finds in this paper. What I've tried to do is to look quite realistic, I think, realistically at some very everyday processes that happen inside research agencies: peer review, evaluation, monitoring, setting of priorities, operation of committee meetings, and suggested, I think, relatively modest changes in relation to each of those processes. The cumulative effect would be quite considerable. And taking your motor car analogy, of course, the most unlikely element of this scenario is, of course, that all the information and communication technology would operate, or even that its connectivities and integration would be remotely possible. And I think that is the most surprising thing, in a way, I think, just to look at the realities of just how difficult it is proving inside organisations like research councils just to get these technologies integrated in some kind of workable way. And we're not talking about particularly kind of fancy stuff here. We're talking about, you know, technologies which, well, Bill and others wrote about nearly 10 years ago, I think, in existence. I've quoted in the paper. And still, the capacity of these technologies to deliver in any kind of meaningful way is by no means proven. So I think this is a less grandiose future than the e-university. But it's still, I quite agree, it's still ringed around with doubt.
Could I just sandwich in but your research councils are an entirely different position than an e-university. I mean, several years ago, before I came to the UK, I filed a proposal to NSF, which was required to be electronic. There were so many proposals to this call for proposals that we had to stage the electronic submission over several days, depending on your position in the alphabet, because there were thousands of submissions electronically. And and a research council can insist all submissions are electronic. Now, for better or worse, I'm not sure if that's but it's a very different kind of market position than a e-university waiting for students to apply. If this is, but we had several, Gustavo and then Christine.
I want to refer to the portion of your paper on managing uncertainty, and I'm bringing here theories of computer-mediated communication and research that actually shows that decision-making under uncertainty, computer-mediated communication is not good. Face-to-face communication and discussion in large and exchange is much better. Given that the Research Council has so much uncertainty in the decisions, how you try to merge between these two different bodies of knowledge?
Yes, I think I'm talking about uncertainty in a slightly different way, and my starting point here would be that the whole process of funding science is inevitably an uncertain process. I mean, it's coming engenders within the whole process this whole idea. You never know at the end of the day the product, and that's one of the kind of key questions that research funding agencies always have to cope with. And that's what PrincipalAgent Theory talks about, this whole notion of kind of moral hazard and selecting the right agents. And of course that's why research councils invest so much time and effort in trying to ensure that they select the right projects rather than spreading money more widely around, which would be a perfectly valid alternative in principle. The uncertainties that decision makers face are very often to do with their understanding of the qualities of the people who are applying and the ability of the people who are applying to deliver results. And I think what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that if the data which exists on individual performance in research was more accessible, more readily accessible to decision makers, then this would in some way help to reduce the uncertainties which they face. It's nothing much more complicated than that. I think you're talking about a slightly different point, which is whether or not the kind of risks in decision making would be increased if the decision makers were not actually in the same room talking to each other and were trying to operate on a kind of remote basis. And that, I think, is an interesting point which I haven't given enough thought to, and I'd be interested to have a look at that literature, because of course there are enormous advantages to research councils if they can start to implement the benefits of remote communication, because a very large part of the costs of any research council, research agency, is simply the cost of bringing people together in large numbers of meetings from across long distances, which I think is possibly why the National Science Foundation has been one of the leaders in this field, simply because I imagine the costs of running the NSF in those terms must be very high.
Christine and then Ted. Yes.
Following a bit on Steve's point about this utopian vision, the research councils of the UK and the European Commission and the US are investing large amounts of money in e-science, e-infrastructure, e-research, e-social science, and so on, which sort of presumes that this distributed, collaborative, data-intensive model is actually going to work. So do we have a disconnect in terms of the research councils funding a utopian vision but not trying it themselves, or would they try it themselves as a means to learn what is really possible in funding? I mean, is there some relationship here that could be exploited?
I think that's a very interesting point, which to my mind relates to some very interesting material in organization theory, because this is about organizations having capacity to kind of fund and externalize certain activities without having any intention of adopting them themselves. And perhaps I can, now that I've left the ESRC, relate to the story. I do remember many years ago, genuinely, in the ESRC council were debating whether they could get some advice from outside, and one council member said very vigorously, the last thing we want in this building is any social scientists. And so I think there is this kind of tendency for organizations to kind of reject their own kind of knowledge base. I don't understand enough about it to know why that is the case, but I think there are quite a few examples, and this may be one of them.
Ted.
Yeah, I don't know if I heard you correctly, but I thought you said toward the end that the research councils actually steer the direction of the development of technology. And I'm a little surprised to hear that, because thinking the examples I can think of, TCP/IP was perhaps would not have happened if it were not for the DARPA grant, but it could be argued it probably would have. Email, I'm not sure whether there was governmental input on, but certainly word processing, Photoshop, hypertext, the web, Napster, and the latest peer-to-peer super thing, I forget the name of it, all of them, I believe, were highly individualized initiatives which got later funding, but really took their basic form and shape prior to any input from research councils. It seems to me that I think of Christopher Columbus, whose expedition was actually really in part technological and scientific research, i.e., if we go that way, do we get there? a binary question which was not correctly answered for some time. But the best you can do is hold your breath and hope. Not the notion of actual guidance is, I think, a bit of a delusion.
I would have to rewind the tape, but I don't think I did say that. What I think I may have said is that research councils seek to shape the direction in which science takes and in scientific research takes, and I think that's a different issue. So I think your case is well made, but we could rewind the tape. I hope I didn't say that. I certainly didn't mean to.
Maybe I misheard.
But shaping, research councils certainly have a shaping role, in my opinion, in relation to the directions in which scientific research takes, or potential for that anyway.
Ralph, you, and then Alex.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in a way, asking Steve's question from a slightly different perspective. At the OII, we've had a number of talks about e-democracy by Stephen Coleman yesterday, among others. And one of the issues is always, how does this new tool allow wider access and more stakeholders, like you also indicated is one of the things that you wanted for these new research councils. I'm just wondering, with these new technologies, it's often that people take new opportunities, such as interacting via the web or emailing in suggestions and so on. I'm just wondering, has there been any study of whether the research councils in the UK or elsewhere have had wider input through any of these channels? I mean, wouldn't this be something to study, given that this electronic form of submission and publicizing research has been ongoing for quite some time? Is there any study that shows that people have looked at what kind of research councils funding, looked at what kind of projects are funded, emailed suggestions, or taken an more active part?
Well, 2 points. First of all, I think you said, maybe I misheard you too, that I was advocating. I think that's quite important to say, that I'm not advocating. I was simply kind of taking this statement and saying, supposing these opportunities exist, how might they be used, rather than actually, in a sense, advocating them. I think, but having said that, I think we know very little about the kind of issues that you've raised. My hunch, my experience would be that there's actually very little use made of that kind at all in funding agencies. I mean, there are consultation processes that occur, but they're generally speaking, they're of a rather crude kind. We're simply kind of putting something up on the web and waiting for people to kind of send emails and then reading them and coming to some conclusions. Not, I think, a very interactive process. So I suspect your study might not find a lot, but I think that it's an interesting question about why more use is not made, given all the kind of pressures towards engaging with wider publics. That in itself is an interesting point.
But it isn't, I mean, even such a as basic as the web, it's the principal way I find out what the research councils are doing. I mean, it's already become a central aspect of that. Although you think, well, I need to visit, talk to program managers, etc., but that's often difficult. Other than visiting with program managers, web access is probably the principal way I know what's going on in the Research Council.
Now Chris has left the ESRC, we can say, what? The ESRC website?
Well, it could be better, perhaps, but yet it's the only it's better than anything other mechanism to know what when. I mean, we were talking about this in terms of the status of a particular program. Chris, you may even mention in terms of progress on the Virtual Research Council by looking at tracking the website at the ESRC in terms of. I mean, this is a principal window, and that's quite a fundamental change, I would think.
Although I think what I was asking is widening. You know, I mean, people like us, for us, this is a very good tool for researchers who get access to information very quickly and effectively, like we might have done before. My question is kind of more democratic, legitimizing the process. I mean, does it draw more people in? And is that a potential that should be studied? If there has been such a, how that could be increased.
Sorry, but Alex, you had a question.
I was imagining how much this your principal agent model will change in today's world of public-private funding of research. So basically, it seems that since the times of the endless frontier, it has been a long-standing role for not virtual, but the research councils. And it seems that your model fits pretty well with the public funding of research, but how much that will change with a very mixed, bundled public-private funding of research.
Yes, I mean, I think it's clear that there are some areas of science where those kind of relationships have changed already. There's no question that the role of Medical Research Council, indeed the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council in the UK, are now intertwined in a very close way with decisions taken in the private sector. So I think that already happens. Whether it'd be interesting to think about whether, in a sense, a virtual research council might have more opportunities to work creatively in that kind of framework. I sort of have a hunch that they might, in a way, because they've, again, taking this kind of ideal model, they would be better informed, I think, about developments going on in the private sector than perhaps their kind of, quotes, real counterparts in the world of today. So I think that it might be, in a way, another pressure towards this kind of better informed, more analytical agency that, of the kind that I was talking about. I would agree that these are changing times for research councils. It's quite interesting. I've written in another paper and just briefly refer to it here. I think virtually every national European funding agency in the last 12 or 14 years has been subject to a major review by the state. And these are turbulent times for research councils. The old kind of post-Vannevar Bush kind of certainties are certainly under a lot of pressure, I think.
Could I just put one thing that along this line? Isn't it, I see the research councils being in a more competitive position because of in other words, they have to compete with, the research council is not the only game in town, so to speak, and if you're doing research in a particular area, you can, with Google, etc., you can find European Commission projects, private foundations, so forth. You have a wider array of potential opportunities for funding whatever you're doing, and so I would think the ESRC is actually competing more with other private and other public funders within this kind of virtual environment.
I think so, yeah, absolutely correct. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Was it Stephen that was, yeah.
Just returning you to the original principle about a more participatory approach to research, and one of the comments was made about this a few minutes ago was that perhaps wider participation would somehow legitimize the process. But that's not the only function of participation, it seems to me. There are others. It could be that participation informs the process. It could be that participation is a check against bad processes. There are a whole set of reasons for participation. And I'm not sure that I know which of those reasons or how many of those reasons you embrace as a part of the arguments you are putting. The other area of slight unease about this very interesting set of arguments that you've presented here today and in your paper are about a kind of dichotomy that seems to be reflected in your argument between the static, resistant, analog state and a new body of virtuality. And I see that dichotomy again and again, whether it's the e-university or whether it's other new e-bodies. There is an assumption within that kind of thinking that funding organisations, ministries, whatever, are somehow not going to change. They're non-dynamic. They don't become more virtual. They don't become more interactive. I suspect that the likelihood is that the two processes will meet each other halfway along the road. That is to say, as governments start to become slightly more dynamic, slightly more interactive, slightly more porous, and virtual bodies don't become fully realised but become partly realised, you just have a change in the nature of governance, which is perhaps what you're really describing here.
Yes, again, I'd want to stress, I think, that I was simply in this paper trying to point out that if you move towards this kind of technological future, you have the kind of choices for wider participation that you're talking about. I don't think I was trying to argue, I would have my own personal views, but I don't think I was trying to argue that there was any particularly kind of desirable future there, simply that research agencies have those kinds of opportunities, and indeed participation could, as you say, be that kind of wide participation could influence decision making. I think if it didn't, it would probably, in the medium term, let alone the longer term, would not succeed. So I think that probably all those kinds of influences and changes that you talk about would and should occur. I wasn't trying to choose between them. I take the point you make about the dichotomy, and I'd have to look again at the paper. I certainly wasn't trying to suggest that there's any evidence that, that either the principal state or the research council agency are the more likely to be kind of technologically adventurous. I think you can see examples of both. What I think you could argue is that a relatively small, flexible agency like a research council has perhaps more opportunity to change its processes and approaches than perhaps a kind of official organ of the state like a ministry, where I think there are a lot more kind of embedded kind of trajectories of behaviour and so on. So I think research councils do have an opportunity to be more flexible. You could imagine them adopting this future, I think, rather more readily than you could expect a government department. So I think you might see them as kind of potential kind of engines of innovation of this kind. And what I try to argue in the paper is that they do have a strong vested interest in making these kinds of changes, partly for the reasons people have given. They are now increasingly in a very competitive situation, and improved information, improved connectivity would certainly, I would argue, improve their competitive position.
I just maybe one more mind experiment. But I can see how the information and communication technologies to complement what research councils are already doing would inevitably improve their ability to do what they do now. But if other things are changing at the same time, for example, if research councils are simultaneously more constrained in terms of resources, and universities are more dependent upon grants, and therefore the numbers of grant submissions are rising. So you have more proposals, more rapid turnaround of proposals, fewer staff within the research councils. And simultaneous with those kinds of trends moving with the virtual research, it's likely that the Virtual Research Council will be further distance researchers from program managers and the people at the Research Council than actually complement what they are already doing. And I mean, how do you separate out, these simultaneous trends that...
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a complicated, if not a complex, process, and I think you've pointed to some of the reasons why the Virtual Research Council will not develop in the kind of ideal way, which is kind of posited in this paper. I think I just want to make a couple of further comments on that. The first thing, I think, what is particularly interesting about ICTs and research councils, what I've tried to suggest in the paper, is the research councils are about the flow of ideas, and this is not often recognised, I think. I mean, of course they're about the flow of money, but they're also about the flow of ideas. So they're about communication. And so, a priori, it seems to me that an organisation which is dependent entirely on the rapid communication of high-quality ideas ought to have some kind of positive relationship with developing information and communication technologies, in principle. In practice, of course, it's much more difficult than that. And what I've said in the paper, perhaps didn't stress enough in my talk, is it's very obvious that this is an extraordinarily expensive process. I mean, to achieve the kind of, I think, quite modest kind of technological future that I've set out in this paper is a very expensive process. The money has to come from somewhere. It's not easily going to be found. It's not easily going to be provided by the state, and it's not easily going to be legitimate for the research councils to divert huge amounts of resources from science into creating this kind of technological platform, which I would say in some ways they need. So this is going to be, I think all the omens, if you like, are of a much more kind of cautious and fragmented kind of approach. And an institution which is under pressure at the present time, I think, as it is evident from these series of reviews, that depends on communication and makes kind of mistaken decisions in the progress towards improving its communication technologies will be at risk. And I think there is a real danger for this kind of...
Let's follow on Bill's point, because I think we all know what the phenomenon Bill's talking about, where, the number of submissions increasing, and you refer to the costs of this and so on, of course, all of which works against virtuality. It means more and more of a paper and drudge mill at the centre. And most of your suggestions were very interesting. They mostly concern this communication flow. I mean, I don't know the ESRC website very well, but of the EPSRC website, I mean, they now want all documentation in and out to be via the website. Paper is now a no-no, both for proposals and for reviews. But on the other hand, none of that touches the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies at the centre of Research Council is the peer review mystery. And it seems to me that must come under threat as the volume increases, the costs go up. So what I really want to ask, if you can sort of speculate that information technology might move into the Holy of Holies, I mean, what happens then? I mean, it seems it's quite conceivable now. Well, look, Landau in Colorado has shown that his software can mark student essays exactly the same grades as professors. Bang. Okay. Now, I'm not saying proposals will fall foul, but we can think about it. It wouldn't be very hard now to show that this proposal is virtually identical to that proposal of 4 years ago, identical to your paper, not yours, somebody's paper of 10 years ago. That would, I mean, I can imagine filters at the Holy of Holies. Can you imagine things? I mean, is it possible, or can that not be touched? Is that a religious call?
No, I think it certainly can be touched. I think many people would fear that perhaps it will be touched quicker than you're kind of suggesting. I think, I mean, there is obviously a vested interest in what research funding agencies need to do is choose the best people with the resources available to them. They need to prove to their paymasters that they have delivered this kind of quality control. Clearly they have a vested interest in doing this as cheaply and efficiently as possible, and I see no barrier within the Research Council system to moving in that kind of direction. On the other hand, as I point out in the paper, Research Councils are kind of hybrid organisations, and they depend very heavily for their ideas on the positive contributions of the research community. And to what extent a kind of move in that direction would alienate the actors on whom they depend would be an issue which they would have to consider very seriously. And a couple of places in the paper I say that I think there are some perfectly logical directions that these kind of ICT developments could take research councils, which would be in a way counterproductive, because they have to retain the trust and confidence of the people who provide the ideas and do the research. So peer review has that kind of, as you call it, kind of magical quality, doesn't it, that it engages the research community with the funding decisions in a way which, if it was lost, I think might be troublesome.
But also the key to any religious mystery is that it remains a mystery, and as long as the process is not revealed, and in the peer review process, the exact person making the review is not revealed. If it happens not to be a person, who knows?
Much more detailed review. I wrote a joke today, but 5 years ago, on how the whole RAE could be automated. I mean, it was a joke, of course. I mean, people are going to start publishing non-joke papers like this.
There are people. I mean, it's odd that we talk about the mystery as if this is an entirely asymmetric system. I mean, presumably people are working on automatic grant proposals. And you just feed in the key terms, and you get the ideal, because you know from this person's studies about what counts as a really good essay. You can then manufacture a really good essay. So I don't see that there's necessarily...
Why cut out the middle virtuality then and have the actual whole research project built from a spine machine?
This gives us a lot of good ideas. Well, we've sort of gone over time. We said to end the webcast at 3:30, but I mean, there was one question that about, and by the way, the people will be. I don't know how long you'll virtually follow this, but people can email questions to you, and Chris has agreed to respond by email to others. So we might expand the range of the seminar by a few people, and that's great if we do. But just looking at the major barriers to the Virtual Research Council. Are they legal, institutional, social, or what?
I don't think they're legal. I think they are primarily social, in the sense that the kind of decisions that are necessary to kind of allocate the resources which a virtual research council would require are probably not going to be taken because of the kind of mix of vested interests where people would find developments of this kind conflicting with their own kind of organisational and personal interests. So my feeling is that there is simply, in a way, it's about resources, the barrier to this, but behind that lies the fact that people make other kinds of choices about the kind of where resources ought to be allocated, and the system kind of goes along well enough. And I think that real moves in this direction would probably only be precipitated by some kind of more serious crisis in the research funding system, where people were really forced to look for radical alternatives of this kind. Otherwise, I think, as we'll see in most countries, and the UK is no exception, we'll see kind of muddling along. And I think, as I said, I do see some risks for the kind of research council institutions in muddling along, because I think that they may end up with the worst of all possible worlds. Perhaps ITCTs that don't work very well, don't enhance their capacity to communicate, and do in some way kind of alienate their crucial audiences. And then, of course, at the end of the day, they do depend on their principles for their survival. And if government at some stage finds a more effective mechanism, then changes would certainly occur.
Okay. Well, let me thank everybody for coming to this seminar, and thank Chris for submitting this article to ICS and for doing this webcast, which I know that you're somewhat reluctant to do, but it was a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you. Okay, there's coffee outside, I think. If you,